Welcome, everyone. My name is Clarence White. I'm the Associate Director at the Eastside Freedom Library. We're pleased that everyone is able to join us this evening. We're even more pleased and honored to have Dr. Josie Johnson and Tish Jones here in conversation with us. We are pleased to be part of the series with the Ramsey County Historical Society, the History Revealed series. And we've had many events along the way, both in the library and virtually as we're doing now. And we actually were able to host an event celebrating the release of Dr. Johnson's book. If you want to see that, it is archived on our YouTube channel, just the Eastside Freedom Library YouTube channel. We would love it if you took a look at that as much as we're glad that you're here tonight. We're going to be in conversation with our two guests. And at some point, some of you will also be able to pose questions as well. But before we get to that conversation, I would like to hand it over to Robin at the Ramsey County Historical Society, who can do some of the housekeeping and tell us a little bit more.
Great. Thank you, Clarence. Hi, everybody. Thank you all for coming. I'm Robin Priestley with the Ramsey County Historical Society, and I want to thank everybody at the Eastside Freedom Library for helping us with this series of History Revealed programs. I think it's been 3 years now. We've been working on History Revealed programs with the Eastside Freedom Library. So we're working on programs coming up throughout 2021. Right now, we're still going to be doing online programs probably through the summer, but please check our websites, and I will share this screen with those links for more upcoming programs. So I'd also like to thank our publishing partner Subtext Books for carrying the books, and that Hope in the Struggle book, which is a wonderful book, is available at Subtext. So please check them out. They will have it on their website. And also, please check out both of our websites and consider supporting the Ramsey County Historical Society and the Eastside Freedom Library. We rely on the support of members and friends like you to continue to present these programs and all of our other efforts. And there are some great benefits for joining either organization or both. So all of that's on our website. This program is being recorded, and it will be available on our RCHS YouTube channel, as well as on the Eastside Freedom Library's YouTube channel within a few days. So a few technical reminders. Please keep your microphones and personal cameras turned off, and please feel free to type your questions and comments in the chat. We'll have questions at the end of the program. And then after the program, when the recording is done, you may turn on your microphones and cameras if you'd like to chat later. So RCHS is committed to presenting the stories and histories of everyone in our community. And we are so pleased to be able to bring you tonight's program, as well as a program next week on March 4th with Donna Haverty-Stack, who's going to be talking about the fierce life of Grace Holmes Carlson, Catholic, socialist, feminist. And again, links to sign up for that Zoom presentation are on both websites. So let me introduce tonight's speakers, which we are so excited and so honored to have both of these wonderful women with us tonight. Born in 1930 in San Antonio, Texas, Josie R. Johnson has been an educator, activist, and public servant for more than 7 decades. Along with her work for the Urban League and the University of Minnesota, Josie has been office manager, campaign manager, and chief of staff for multiple political campaigns and public officials, including being campaign manager for the first African-American lieutenant governor of Colorado and co-chair of the African-American DFL caucus in Minnesota. Josie holds degrees in sociology, education, and education administration. She lives in Minneapolis and continues to serve her community, advocating for equal rights and social justice. Tish Jones is a poet, educator, cultural strategist, and cultural producer from St. Paul, Minnesota, and is the founder and executive director of True Art Speaks. Tish has performed poetry in venues throughout the United States, and her work can be found in A Moment of Silence by True Ruts in the Playwright Center from 2020, the Minnesota Humanities Center's anthology entitled Blues Vision, African American Writing from Minnesota, that was put out by the Minnesota Historical Society Press in 2015 and in other places. Tish has been awarded fellowships from the Arts Matters Foundation, Springboard for the Arts, the Intercultural Leadership Institute, and other places. Former director of the Brave New Voices International Youth Poetry Slam Festival, her work explores the ways in which art can function as a tool for social transformation, liberation, and education. Tish has always had a passion for bridging arts and culture, civic engagement, and youth development. And for more on her personal praxis, see Tish's TED Times Minnesota talk on spoken word as a radical practice of freedom. So, Josie Johnson and Tish Jones, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Robin. Again, thanks to both of you for joining us this evening. I have been looking forward to this conversation for a while. And I'm going to start out by asking you guys some questions, and we can take it from there and we'll see where this goes. I know there's a wealth of experience and knowledge and wisdom and energy that probably could fill several conversations, but I wanted to start off with one thing. The book talks about a lot of people, and one of the wonderful things about the book is that it names so many people who played an important role in developing sort of the activism that can change our society. And one of the great things is that it also talks about the women who are often left out in these conversations, especially from the civil rights era. And Dr. Johnson quotes Dorothy Height in the book, where she says, "We must never lose sight of the quiet revolution that women are involved in, that in the long run will make a difference." And I guess I want to start with you, Josie Johnson. If you could flesh out that quiet revolution, what has it consisted of? How has it been part of the larger struggle for freedom and equality?
Thank you very much, Clarence. And I want to say how deeply honored I am to have been invited for this conversation, particularly with our young scholar, Tish Jones. I've watched that young woman for a long time, and I am so proud of the work she has done and continues to do, and the leadership she offers our young people who need to be reassured that our struggle can continue and do good for some of the things we're interested in.
Thank you, Elder.
Thank you, darling. I met Dorothy Height many, many years ago through the sorority that I was very engaged in, Delta Sigma Theta, but also knew Dorothy and the work she did in the community. And at one period in the struggle for freedom and justice, Dorothy decided that the work that was published and talked about and seemed to be the work that was very clearly seen and heard was done by men primarily. The reports were by men. And she decided that it would be very important for people to begin to know the work that women had put into the struggle, that it wasn't just a men's struggle, it was also a women's struggle. So she had a meeting one weekend in Nashville, Tennessee, with a group of diversity and religious beliefs and activities. So she offered the suggestion that women ought to be more engaged in the struggle. Well, not that they weren't engaged, but that needed to be known more publicly. So this meeting agreed that yes, they also felt that women were ignored in the struggle and that it was sincerely, the need was sincere for all people to understand. Excuse me. So she decided with her group of co-workers in the struggle, many of whom were our Jewish community friends, Christian, and others. And she had this conference, and the agreement was yes, there ought to be a plan for women's work to be seen and to be heard and to know about. So the decision was made that certain states would be invited, the southern states, that people in the South needed to know, not only our people, but all people needed to know that women were engaged in this struggle. And so they created a program called Wednesdays in Mississippi. And they selected groups of women, both Black and white women from these communities, to be a part of this experiment. And one of the cities that they selected in the state of Mississippi was Jackson, Mississippi. And I had the joy, blessing, participation in that struggle in Jackson, Mississippi. I must admit, for the sake of as much clarity as possible, my family and friends and community, there were people if you'll remember, Jackson, Mississippi was the flag of abuse of Black people, both children, men and women. And there were just lots of stories about the abuse, the killing, the denial of our people in Jackson, Mississippi. So 4 women were selected to go to Jackson. A woman who represented the Jewish faith, one who represented the Christian faith, and then the 2 of us Black women who represented our community. One of the women that with whom a Black St. Paul newspaper at that time, Mary Kyle. We were given instructions a good many weeks before our trip. We were then, we gathered at the airport. We were able to greet each other at the airport, and we found chairs, seats on the airplane. At that time, I don't remember that you were assigned a seat. So we sat together, and our Anglo friends sat together. And when we got to Chicago, we were instructed to separate. So the Black women, white women. And when we got to Jackson, Mississippi, we were also separated. My friend Mary assigned and accepted with great grace a Black family. One of the members was a school teacher. They took us that night immediately to a gathering of Black people in Jackson who were being trained and educated about voting. From that beginning, that wonderful, scary beginning, we were then able to be engaged in trips in Jackson, Mississippi. We went to something that you all will remember the name, Freedom Schools, because they had closed, if you'll remember, in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled on desegregating the schools. All the schools in the South closed. Jackson closed, and the adults had to find places that could accommodate an education opportunity. So there were churches and basements and all kind of facilities like that. And we went to one of those. They were called Freedom Schools. And we went to one in Vicksburg, Mississippi, and saw young people collecting books, creating libraries, and we were able to meet the children and others. That night, after we left that school, it was destroyed. It was burned to the ground. And I felt very guilty. I kept saying, maybe if we hadn't gone, they wouldn't have done that. But we had a chance to drive through Vicksburg, Mississippi, meet some of our people who were suffering, to use a word that we can all visualize what was going on with them, the type of housing, the denial of education and opportunities. So we were able to gather and meet with other members of that Jackson, Mississippi community. But what we were not able to do and decided not to do it, sorry about that, we thought we'd cut this off. What we learned was that those people who wanted, white people who wanted to meet with us, were not allowed to. So we had to find ways of meeting with our people and talking about things that needed to be talked about. And what we did, just the long and short of it, was to experience the oppression that our people felt in Jackson, Mississippi, and Vicksburg, Mississippi, that whole area. And we saw the determination of Black men, women, and children to get beyond the isolation of registering and voting, and they were eager to learn about the process and willing to sacrifice. We were able to go to the one place, Jackson State in Mississippi, where we had faculty, integrated faculty, who made you think someday, you know, we're almost back where we were in Jackson, Mississippi, but to feel could set the model for the issues that were being fought by the people. So Jackson, Dorothy Height, and others of that period, ministers who were fearful, socialites who were fearful, pulled their screens down and covered. So it was for all of us an opportunity to come back to Minnesota. We were restricted. That was Joseph Kennedy's attorney general at the time, and everybody was fearful of the work that Black people were doing. And we were not then free to share that Jackson, Mississippi experience in the public. So we were able to come back, talk to our people, and talk about the things we saw. Jailing little teenage children, killing African-American men, bombing property. So to be able to associate what you saw with the history that we knew and wanted the world to know, and to share with our people who had worked so hard for freedom and help the whole community, nation, state, world understand the commitment that we had as a people to freedom and justice. And education. Education has been, of course, our backbone, and we saw that so clearly exercised in Jackson, Mississippi. So I probably went much beyond what Clarence asked, but when you think about the struggle of our people and their determination in a place like Jackson and Vicksburg, Mississippi, you don't lose it. It never leaves you. Clarence, if I abused your question, I hope you'll forgive me.
No, we're honored for these stories. I did want to, there are some things that I hope we can go back to in that, but before we go on, I wanted to check in with Tish, and maybe you can talk about some of the roles of women in today's struggle with younger generations and what you see happening now.
Thank you, and thank you, Elder Johnson, for just sort of laying the foundation and the history of that work rooted in, you know, our civil rights struggle in the early and mid 1900s. I appreciate that. I think that when we talk about contemporary Black women and the work that we're doing, we definitely glean back to those times. And in terms of thinking about some of our organizing work, I know it finds a lot of its roots there, with some of the women that were leading the charge nationally in movements for Black power and Black liberation and justice. So I think I right now point to a lot of queer Black women who are in the movement. We have the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. We have the sisters from the Combahee River Collective. We have folks who are putting out a lot of theory, Patricia Hill Collins and Black feminist thought. We have a lot of local organizers who are at the forefront of movements for Black liberation and justice. And we stand on the shoulders of all of the Black women that came before us and all of the women organizers that came before us. So I echo and underscore a lot of what Elder Josie has already said. And I think, there are a lot of sayings and a lot of things that point back to specifically Black women being, the quote unquote mule of the world, right? So our people, Black women specifically as leaders in the movement, our liberation means the liberation for everyone. So we're in it and we've been in it.
Absolutely, Tish. What I find very interesting right now, because Black women have always been engaged in the issues that were being faced, and we were generally in the background. Our brothers were the people, the faces that people saw of the struggle. And of course, we were always there. When you think of the March on Washington, all the women who had been, how many were actually on the program? So it's a part of the history that your generation, that's why I am so thankful to have lived this long. When I see you young women out there and doing the things that you're doing, more just recently, modeling, demonstrating what it means to be an activist and how to collect the community, the total community, and our young women and young men, children, also learning, watching, seeing what you're mystic about the things that Black women have done always. Look at the church movements and the schools and the other agencies that have served all of us and served our people. And, you know, an old elder, thank you so much for using that word, when we see what our children taught us and modeled for us and are now able to show that with such pride and dignity, it's a joy, darling. And I am interested in you knowing that, because I remember you from way back with young people meeting in the church and teaching them and getting them organized to march. You were marching way back then, Tish. So the modeling that you did then and continue to do serves the young people to see what can and what's possible. So your elder thanks you for picking up where your other generations began also, and tried to protect you and model for you and demonstrate the strength that we have as a people.
Elder Josie Johnson, you're gonna make me cry on the Zoom. I think that's the highest compliment I've ever received in my life. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, darling. Thank you.
And it's also a great illustration on how legacy works among great people and great movements. So
Right.
thanks for that. There are a couple of things that have been said that sort of bring us to a different question. As Black people, our relationship to education is very complicated. Extremely complicated, and several of the struggles and several of the complicated relationships were illustrated in the book. But I was wondering if both of you could talk about the role that educational institutions have had in the struggle for equality. And I know, depending upon where those institutions are situated, what their perspective is, and who's in control of them makes a big difference, and also what point in history we're talking about. But I don't know if any of you want to talk about that. I know, Dr. Johnson, you talk a lot about your education and your involvement with not just pursuing your education, but helping others and representing them in their pursuit. But I'd like it if both of you could respond to that.
And if you don't mind, and if Tish doesn't mind, I'm really interested in how her generation, sees that struggle, and whether the history, commitment, and determination for education, whether in the judgment of our current or younger group of revolutionaries, whether education, how that's defined, is it just the academy, or are there other methods that our young people use today or see today as indicators of education. And if Tish doesn't mind and doesn't feel I'm pushing it on her, I'll love to hear that. So thank you.
I do not mind. Yes, ma'am. I would gladly answer this question. I believe that I know we know there are other forms of education, and our people need all of the alternative forms of education outside of the institution, outside of, the historically white canonical way in which we're indoctrinated into being educated in this Westocentric, Eurocentric um, world in which we're operating in, right? We all operate under, capitalism, and the system of white supremacy right now, unfortunately, until we eradicate those systems, right? And I think I have a poem about this, right? The poem Tracks is really talking about traditional institutions of education being the site of some of the most egregious forms of violence against Black people. It starts there, the way that they track us into prison, specifically in a contemporary sense, right? Once slavery was abolished, there was a new system created, and that was the prison industrial complex. So these schools, once they were burning down our freedom schools, and they decided to discontinue allowing us to be educated in our own spaces, albeit they were educating us with tattered books and leftover materials and incomplete information, right? We were tracked into these other spaces. And it's this big system. The educational system is a cog in the wheel, because it's also connected to, again, like I said, connected to capitalism and the way that capitalism works. It's connected to housing. It's connected to gentrification. It's connected to the history of white flight and the creation of ghettos in America, poverty. So I think we have to think about all of those things in concert with one another. But specifically, it was a painful moment of my own education and research as a poet, and as a person who feels and felt like a victim of the institution of education in America, specifically in Minnesota, where we have the widest education gap between Black folks and white folks, in K through 12 systems in the country, where we were tracked via George Bush's No Child Left Behind into prisons based on our test scores in grade school, right? So for me, when I think about education, when I think about Black folks and the kind of education that we need spaces like freedom schools, the freedom schools that we have right now. We need our after school programs, right? We need community groups like March, Men Are Responsible for Cultivating Hope. We need those spaces so that we can receive a complementary education that is geared towards our liberation and our knowledge of ourselves, and how to navigate these systems within this skin and this experience.
Right. And when you stop to think about that, and you in education back as far as you can, you will have the image of our grandmothers teaching children undercover, getting whatever light they can get to shine on the material they're trying to teach them. Or you have this wonderful period of that 12-year period of those Black people creating laws and policies that benefited everybody. They did not just think in a singular way. It opened doors for everybody. When you realize that our educators, I think about the times of just working in our schools in Minneapolis, how long ago that effort to open it up for all children and to have the opportunity to feel good and comfortable about what they were learning, you all have brought it to another level, which I think is such a blessing, to know that your ancestral belief in education and struggle is in you, darling, and it's in everything you do and all that is going on right now, so that our children now, you know, when I see you young people dancing on the street and organizing, I think you're free and you feel good about yourself. You don't have to hide that you're trying to learn and do. And as you said, education in our culture is not just the academy, it's everything. And what we learn early is that it gets taken away if we're not careful. And if we don't identify it and claim it, it gets lost. So what you're doing, and I wish you would share that poem if you feel up, excuse me, up to it, Tish. It's a beautiful, it's a beautiful poem, darling.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. I think I just love you. I just love you. You're so amazing.
And I love you too. I remember you from way back. So thank you.
There's something that you said that reminded me, I wanted to bring up also music, the education in Black music, the coded language that we use, all of our art, I think has also been for years a part of our educational process, right? Our desire to respond to the drum, the ways in which our art led us to freedom, right? We all know who Moses is. It took some other folks some time to catch on. You know what I'm saying? And I think that that's another way that we are continuing our education through the music. So when you mentioned, when you see us on the street dancing, you say to yourself that we're free. That's a part of it. That music has always has given us the space to imagine ourselves free. And that's a really important part of the education process. So thank you for bringing that up.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, the two things that we are really involved with here at the library are amplifying the voices of scholar activists and artist activists. And Dr. Johnson, you talk about art and how it works in the struggle in your book. And of course, Tish, you are both that artist activist and that scholar activist, and reimagining both of those things, and we really appreciate that. And also, Dr. Johnson, thanks for that smart question that you posed to Tish. That really is illuminating. We have a question. I'm going to switch it up a little bit. Ben Mackay asked a question, and he is asking, in your view, and I guess he is speaking to both of you, are men in the struggle receptive to what women are bringing to the current needs to move deeper toward racial equity?
Thank you, Ben. It's nice to hear a question from you. If I understand the question, I believe there was a breakthrough in the 60s when Black people collectively examined the struggle. And there was no longer just one gender among our group of people working on any of the struggle or being encouraged to or only acknowledged. And I think part of that had to do with the women who became very active in the 60s. They were no longer in the background bringing the water to the speaker. They were part of that speaking group and bringing the kind of energy and new ideas to the struggle that opened it up a bit, I think, for both Black and women and men. And the feeling of the children, the fact that there was so much in that period, and I focus on the 60s because I think it was a very freeing, open period where we began to see ourselves as a collective, both men and women struggling, and more freely able to meet in groups and talk about things and not be so fearful that we might hurt each other's feelings. We were much more open about issues, identified our complicated experiences that perhaps led us to see things the way we saw them. But the fact that men, I believe, began to really see what their sisters were doing, and Black women feeling freer to share what they knew and ideas they thought ought to be tested. And I believe that began to open the spirit of unity, which then allows all the other interests to be shared and felt and discussed. When you don't feel you are just in sort of one category, one group, but knowing the history of Black women's struggle throughout, and the fact that Black men and what they had to do in order to understand that it was a male female struggle, and what women had done historically forever, being able to really talk about that together without anger, without a sense of having to not acknowledge the common struggle of Black men and Black women and the difference in that, and where those changes were beginning to be seen, so that the unity of us as a people was the struggle that we could focus on rather than gender issues. And I don't know if Tish is experiencing that now at that group.
Hmm. I think that, we hear the cliche or adage that it takes however long you've been in a relationship, that it's going to take that long or at least half as long to get over it when you're out of it, right? And I think about Black people's long, violent, and abusive relationship under the thumb of white supremacy, right? The 1600s is, early documentation that's widely agreed upon, I should say, in terms of when our ancestors were brought over to this place, this stolen land,
Mhm.
as to be the enslaved, right?
Right.
And I think that the way that I would answer that question is we are unlearning, some of the most damaging things that we have been taught. We do not necessarily come from, it is not widely accepted, was not widely accepted in our history, um, to subjugate the perceived other in the ways in which we have subjugated the perceived other in this land. Those are things that we have learned and put into practice and have had to unlearn. So when I look through Black American history, I look at it and, there's a bit of joy that I feel because as time moves forward, we're unlearning certain things. So when
Mhm.
I hear you, Dr. Johnson, when I hear you talk about um, the 60s as a marker for when there was some unity in the struggle and amongst gender specifically, I think that's a wonderful time marker for us. That means we began to unlearn patriarchy around the 60s. You know what I mean? So I think that there's all these things because I look at Bayard Rustin. I look at James Baldwin. I look at Marsha P. Johnson, and those are elders and folks that I learned from that were about Black liberation, and they were not, deemed heteronormative at the time in which they were operating. They were on the precipice of a shift in culture, right? A shift in culture nationally in a US context, and a shift in culture in a Black American context. And that to me just shows that we're unlearning. So I'm excited to see what we continue to unlearn, and how many different expressions of our Blackness continue to come to the forefront of our movement for liberation.
That is such a critical observation, because so much of what our people have done since their enslavement and unenslavement and all of the other pieces of developing and really getting back. When I think about my family growing up in Texas, and my parents, and what my and they were college graduates, and my father wanted to become a lawyer. That was not, there were no graduate programs in the South for Black people. But yet they decided that they were going to do some of what they wanted to do, create what they wanted in the framework of their control and demand. So, you get it. And it just, like you said, the fact that it takes so long, and you're taught it's so deeply etched in the fabric of not only Black men and women, but it's in the whole system. It's how laws are written and policies are interpreted. And so that's why I say I'm so optimistic when I see my young people, because they're so proud of who they are. I'm just so happy to hear you say, looking back at your ancestors and building on that. That's very important, very important. And we have to hold on to it, because, my dear, if we're not careful, that too will be taken away from you. It'll be renamed, redirected, and we have to stay focused, really focused on us and what we have done, what we've survived, and what our ancestors taught us. It's that group that gave us the seeds we are observing now for freedom and justice. They did it.
That's right.
Did it. And our children need to know that.
That's right. You've done it. You're a part of that legacy. So I thank you.
Thank you.
This most recent part of the conversation sort of relates to this next question. Toward the end of the book, Dr. Johnson writes, over time, my observation has been that the degree of hatred that those who enslaved our ancestors perpetrated toward Black people is deeply etched into the psyche of America. The justification that was given for enslaving our ancestors, the treatment and the teaching of the inferiority of Black people have created a lasting problem. I'm wondering if both of you can respond to that, maybe elaborate a little bit on what you've already been saying or some other parts of that, maybe talk about the healing, but maybe some of the activism that is responding to this lasting problem.
Yeah. Tish, do you want to start us off?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. I think, and to be additive to what we've already said, I think that growing pangs, I think that when we talk about healing, we have to understand that it is a painful process. And again, we have been suffering and made to suffer for so long. And it's all of us, right? We always talk about that, like the system of white supremacy and the success of the construct of whiteness has not only hurt Black people, has not only hurt Indigenous people, has not only hurt people of color, it has also hurt white people, folks of European descent who choose to operate under a willful ignorance and cloak of whiteness, divorced from their ethnic identity and traditions, and impart their humanity because of the privilege and inherent oppression that comes with operating within whiteness, right? Um, so I think that what we've experienced and what we're experiencing now as people sort of, for lack of a better phrase, wake up is part of those growing pains. And I was on a Zoom earlier with Miss Latasha Brown, one of the founders of Black Votes Matter, and she was talking about humanity, and it resonates with me so much because I think that's what it is. I think it's juicy to me to think about that terminology, right? I've been thinking about and talking to folks on a national level, and they're like, oh yeah, you know, the current movement for Black liberation it started in Minneapolis, you know, the uprisings after, you know, brother George Floyd was murdered, you know, we just gotta, and it's true, right? And I think the impact and where we're seeing white folks coming to action, and being called to act, being called to see the humanity in Black folks, to see the humanity in other folks, and why there are folks buying into this movement for racial justice, who, you know, activated around voting in a way that folks haven't activated around voting in a while, right? In droves, historic droves, is because our humanity was tapped into, because what we saw, and I've said this from the beginning, when we witnessed, you know, over 10 minutes of that dear brother lying on the ground, on the concrete, on the south side of Minneapolis, in our cities, we witnessed a public execution. We witnessed a lynching, and it was a modern day lynching, right? It would be what Ida B. Wells Barnett would talk about, right?
That's right.
It and it was contemporary and massive. This is why I love hip hop so much. So hip hop to me in 1983, when the message came out, it was a source of media. It was new media. Global message was produced into the world. You got to see the ghetto in America. It shattered the idea of this, you know, nuclear family, picket fences, and green pastures. It shattered that idea. You saw syringes, broken bottles, burned down buildings, all of that. So
That's
when
right.
George Floyd was murdered, and we had to watch it on our cell phones, on our laptops, on our TV screens, millions of people watched it, our humanity was tapped into. All of that gross indoctrination could not stop people from being people. So some folks were activated around that healing. It was too much weight to bear to be that gross, that hate filled after that moment, because that was a human, that was a man whose life was taken.
That's right. Well, you know that I so appreciate you sharing that, because my immediate reaction to the George Floyd, I have said to him, my brother, you died in a very painful way, but you have helped your people. We talk about people killing, policemen killing Black men. We talk about it, but we have never seen it. This time we saw it, and we saw the casual attitude of the man who killed Floyd. Floyd laying there, unable to move. We saw it. They didn't tell that story. They didn't hear Black people come to the community and say, George Floyd was murdered. We saw it. And they saw it all over the world. And what it may have done is finally the things that our ancestors have been saying since the beginning of humankind, they were able to put what they heard into visual killing. And that's why I say, I'm hoping that George Floyd forgives me, but I say to him, my brother, I and all of us hated to see that happen to you. But other Black men have reported this treatment forever, but it was never believed, never acted on, always some excuse. The brother was running or hiding or doing something, and that's why he got killed. This time, they saw that white man put his knee on that brother's neck, and the brother crying, mother, and it had no impact on that man or the people around him. So I say to our brother George Floyd, thank you. And it's painful for everybody, but you did a service.
That's right. That's
And
right.
it's really something. Sometimes you say to yourself, I don't know how our people, and it creates, I think sometimes about another part of us and our development. And that has to do a lot with, you mentioned it, color. Remember, straight hair and good hair, and people who are smart, use the right language, can speak well, and the others, somehow the society would encourage the well-spoken to see themselves differently than the brother who didn't speak very well. But it's that etched in the fabric, as you mentioned, etched in the fabric of maintaining. I can remember as a girl, I shared this story with my children a million times. My parents were driving down the street in Houston, and at a particular intersection, a Black man was trying to get across the street, and the white car driver driving the car was trying to push him and force him out of the way and threatened to run over him. And the brother looked around at that person and gave him some kind of verbal message. And it was so, because then when he got across the street on the other side, he stopped and just laughed at the fact that he had been able to express himself at that moment and to show that he too could stand. If, the guy could try to run over him, go ahead. But so I'm saying we have as a people been able to demonstrate that grit that our ancestors taught us. And many of you are doing right now. You are strong, you're ignoring some of the traditional ways of our ancestors, and you're creating a world of hope and optimism and pride. Because when I see those little sisters out there in their cute little outfits and the brothers on the other side, remember that thing on a TV? It was a part of a news show, but boy, was I proud of them because they were expressing what was important at that moment to them. But we also know, you all know time and place and when not. And that came from your ancestors too, of knowing how to move forward and keep on keeping on, as my father would say.
Hey.
Yeah. Yeah.
I appreciate that.
I appreciate you. Goodness gracious.
Yeah, we all do.
Thank you.
Just I think that sort of brings up another thing, sort of related, but the summer brought an uprising that was heard and seen and acted around the world. It was a global response. And it started here in Minneapolis. One of the interesting things that the book talks about is, that Minnesota has a really strong history of not only people who were prominent in the struggle, but also a lot of ideas that started here and have been replicated around the country. And I'm wondering if either of you has an idea about, why Minneapolis, why the Twin Cities? I mean, one of the things is that we know that many of the demographic disparities between Black people and white people is the greatest here, whether we're talking about housing or education or healthcare or employment. But is there something else about Minnesota or Minneapolis or St. Paul that you think makes that the deal?
Well, I probably have a different response to that, or conversation around that question, because I've been here when I came, we were at a different point in Minnesota. There were we were about 3% of the population in the early 50s when we came. There were none of the policies that we now have, that we were able to create laws and process for Black people to be able to do some of the things they wanted to do. We were geographically segregated. Part of South Minneapolis, North Minneapolis, that's where we lived. Part of St. Paul, that's where Black people lived. And then I believe that in the struggle of opening the culture of the Twin Cities, there appeared to be a difference that people thought about. They thought that people were free in Minnesota, and that we were different than the struggle that our Black brothers and sisters were launching in the South. And there was a need for Black people to understand that as our numbers grew from 3% to 12%, and now I think we're about 30%, that those attitudes that people had about us were then freely exercised. When I heard my young sister Tish mention the fact that there is so much right now that is happening for Black people, what I am conscious of is the fact that so much has been exercised in Minnesota, but what we saw as our numbers grew, the attitude that people had about us was more freely expressed by the majority community. And that's because the word you used earlier, and so did Tish, etched in the fabric. We became, even with the passage of fair housing and education and jobs, look at where we are right now, as Tish identified for us. We're at the lowest end. When I was lobbying for fair housing and education and those issues in the state capitol, there were people who had never seen Black people before, never talked to one, hardly knew we existed. Now, with the attitude that was really deeply etched, what I say about the struggle right now and what we see, I say that the system under Trump, forgive me for entering politics, but the system under Trump was accepted, approved, and all those people who pretended or tried to hide the fact that they didn't have those racist attitudes about us were free to do it. And so we were able then in Minnesota to show the true colors of the citizenry. We're still fighting. It's almost like you're having to fight fair housing, jobs, education, etc., all over again. Because as more Black people came to Minnesota, more white people became afraid of us, and jobs were less and less. And so it's, when you think about it, it's a very complex and deep carryover from what we know, the attitude of enslaving us and treating us, denying us. It's been there. And so the struggle that young people are facing now with a sense of joy and happiness about their people, who they are, has a big influence, I believe, on the opportunity to open up, to talk about, to encourage, to model, and to challenge the things that were so often taken for granted. So I'm eager to hear my young sister and what is seen in our group right now, because we are in a very bad, to say that Minnesota is at the bottom of the academic ladder, do you realize what a difference that is from the image of Minnesota? Our children, when we moved here, the education system, there were only 12, 3, 10, 15% of us. And our children didn't have that kind of attitude that teachers didn't teach. So they were able to be educated. I've got my middle daughter sitting here who was a student from nursery school through high school, was able to get the kind of education that she was entitled to and deserved. But so many of our children, the attitude that we're not smart, we're not able, and that was passed on in the education of teachers. And in many cases, it may have been deeply laden in the non-acknowledged part of who we are. But then you get a president or some other public figure that supports what the common person truly believes. And it then becomes the more accepted behavior that our children are not doing well in school. They're not getting the kind of quality of life that they deserve, but it gets interpreted as their deficiency, not a system or not a culture or not a history, not a tradition. It becomes us, as it did so early in our life, in our America.
think that's such an important observation, that last piece specifically, that they put the blame and the onus on us all the
Right.
time, right?
Exactly.
And I think what it's an idea that I'm kind of playing around with, but there's something I think about the perceived and imposed invisibility here, right? So like at a state level, we're what, 6-7% of the population, Black folks in the state of Minnesota. And I
Right.
think that, you know, being that we're such a small percentage of the population of Black folks in the state entirely, there's this interesting way in which we fight for visibility here, right? I think we have to make so much noise here in order to be seen. When we go other places, all folks know is Prince, Jimmy Jam, and Terry Lewis. They're like, oh, Black people live there? You're from there? Wow, I didn't know that, right? And I think there's something to that in the psyche, right? Because as we're trying to unlearn the attempt to be white, and I also want to name that, so this is it's a little tangent and aside. One thing that we haven't talked about in terms of like structural and institutionalized racism in the context of having hope in the struggle, which I love, is that whiteness is, it was created, it was a kind, we know that, right? We know that it's a social construct, that race is an illusion, and so on and so forth. But quite specifically, there are varying ethnic groups within the United States and abroad that applied to the US Supreme Court to be white. So like this idea of becoming white is something that like is so deeply ingrained. It's not a personal, it's not like, oh, I want to, no, it's like you needed to try to be white systemically. Like groups of people wanted to be white to obtain certain access to power, privilege, money, wealth, etc. Right? So like there's this unlearning thing that we're doing that is, it's in us, it's in the way that these systems are set up. And when I think about, Black people, Black bodies in a state like Minnesota, where there are so few of us, where so many people have not actually held a conversation with a Black person.
Right.
When you talk about the ideas that come out of here, there's something to be said. There's this like really juicy creative space and inventive space, this magical space about knowing the truth of your existence about while simultaneously being made to feel invisible in a space. You have to be louder, right? You have to be more creative about the way you tell your story, right? You have to be sort of magical in the way that you resist, in a place where people think that you do not, right? In a place where you can feel isolated. Something that blows my mind every election is how blue the Twin Cities are and how red the rest of the state is. And I always remind myself that I have curated my experience here. My world is Black because I made it that way. I am not in a Black space. This is not a safe space, but I have to be so loud and so Black to be safe here, right? So when we're talking about ideas that are born here, they're born here because we have to scream our existence into this place, right? When we go somewhere else, we know it, right? It's less appropriation and it's more like it is what it is. Like when I go down to Mississippi, it is what it is. Like Black culture permeates the area in the South. Like, you know what I mean? Like people like to make it seem like Atlanta is this, cultural anomaly. It's like, nah, Blackness is like just a part of the culture in Atlanta. Actually, there's a lot of us down there, but up here, there's an appropriation of Black culture that happens here, that's accepted here. There's a tokenization that happens of palatable Black folks up here that's accepted here, right? Because it's, adjacent and in proximity to whiteness in a way. So I think that our ideas, certain things that happen, brilliant creatives, these sort of models that seem like anomalies, like the Penumbra theaters or whatever, like, we have a Black run institution, theater institution in Minnesota. And it's great. It's this, I'm not, downplaying the success of Penumbra. What I'm saying is that there's just this way here when you're Black here, that volume is on maximum when you speak here. The volume is on maximum when you do something here, because you're up against this white canvas. You're blacked out on a white canvas.
So very interesting, Tish. I hadn't thought about it that way. And you have introduced something. We often say, having lived here long enough to see the evolution of Black people in Minnesota, to see that in so many instances, the 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 people that we know and how we behave and how we think, you don't sometimes understand that as we grew in numbers here, that was the opportunity for people then to put us in groups and to, even though it's a small percentage from any other place, it's still a number. You look at our the number of Black people who've moved into Minnesota since I've been here, and the fact that we can actually come together and talk about things and do things. We can have that whole issue of Black activities, that was brand new among us. The fact that Black people could organize a march team or whatever the various public accepted activities among us, it could give some of our Black young people hope that they are in a, but then you see everything that's reported in the public paper, if it is a negative, they get a picture with it to make sure that you know what is going on and by whom, so that Minnesota was just kind of a leader. I was here with Hubert Humphrey and Don Fraser and Mondale and the group of white liberals who believed in justice and freedom and equality and really worked for it, so that there were opportunities. And then the system begins to feel more comfortable returning to how it was, and having not educated as many of the people of our rights and justice and our history, sometimes you lose what Clarence identified in the question, and what you've identified, Tish, in just what has happened in your generation of Black people in being able to be expressive and creative, and it's been a joy for us elders to see that, because that it's possible. But I'm saying many of our children who come and the people who are here and observe what can happen here. Black men being killed every day, kids killing each other, the schools not producing the results that you want. Or so much of what goes outside of Minnesota is reflected in Minnesota, and often in probably smaller bites. And it takes a whole lot of them before our people responded. Black people here in Minnesota have been very conscious from way back.
Mm-hmm. I think you're onto something that's so brilliant, as you always are, because I feel like because we have such a small percentage of us here, right? And I think you are 1000% right, Elder. It is, whether it's a small number or not, it is a number. And I think when I'm saying we scream, we're at the top of our lungs, we exercise the muscle of being Black to make sure that our presence is known here. I say that because in these other communities, they do have the power of numbers.
Yeah.
And I think that, our ideas and our practices sometimes tend to read, you know, very radical, very revolutionary, and they have to be so tight and so on point because there are so few of us here. So for us to push this, the agenda of Black liberation here, or the agenda around equity and Blackness here in Minnesota, where we have 90% plus people who are not about that, because let us not start to have a conversation around anti-Blackness in other communities that are non-Black communities. Like, there's a real fight that we have to have, in a real way in which we do have to make a lot of noise and make sure we are dotting our I's and crossing our T's when we do our work in this place. And so,
Exactly.
yeah, I appreciate that.
And your generation is helping us do that, because the um, the trying to get your message across and to do it in ways that you think other people can understand and relate to, and you then discover years later that it was neither heard nor could be related to. And our young people, if that had worked, then equality would be broadly shared, opportunities would be broadly felt, our children would be getting as much as they needed to do as much as they wanted. And when those things don't happen, and we keep talking about it, and laws are passed, but our children, younger people, don't see it that way. They don't see just these little incremental pieces. They want to do the work that you're doing, that the other generations are attempting to do, and they want to see it right now. And that's very important. The squeezing of time is not as important to people who need to get that education and do that work and model for their brothers, younger brothers and sisters. That needs to be done right now. Whereas my generation may have been more willing to give things time, or to keep talking about it, or to keep trying to pass bills and laws. And what my generation is realizing is that you've got hundreds of laws, policies, procedures, but it hasn't made a lot of difference. They're there, but
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think I can't speak for everyone in my generation. I can say for myself though, Elder, is I I'm hoping that the work that I do is in conversation with all the work that you've done and everyone before me. And I say that because there's an urgency now, because we have seen what you all have experienced, because we understand what you all did for us and on our behalf. And we understand the gracious manner in which you all worked with folks who were in opposition to you all. We understand the violence that was enacted upon your bodies, upon your psyche, upon your spirit, upon your heart, right? So there's an urgency, especially while we still have y'all. You know what I mean? There's an urgency for you to be able to have those moments where I know you were able to meet President Obama, right? And like there's an urgency. You deserve to have seen Barack Obama in office as the president of the United States of America. You deserve that for your fight, right? Just like you deserve to see, so you deserve to see the education gap closed here in Minnesota between
absolutely,
Black students and white students. So
absolutely.
that's what I think it is. Like we're in the middle holding both things, where it's like, you know, there's so many of us in our generation who are like, I don't want to have kids because I don't want to bring them into this. We don't necessarily want to feel, we want a place where we want to bring kids into the world. We don't feel like we don't want to. So it's like the urgency is, I want to honor my ancestors, I want to honor my elders, and I want a safe space for my children to be born, to breathe, to grow up, and to live, right?
Yes.
So yeah, just want to offer that.
Thank you. That's very important. And that lifts a lot of the spirit that the system also creates us and them, even among us, and placing the values on us and them. And sometimes I think about our brothers and sisters who have worked so hard for a good academic training and preparation to do the work that they are able to do, need to do, and the system will still categorize them in small groups to make them feel they're different than their other brothers and sisters, to create that us and them among us. And we sometimes have to be reminded that we are the collective and not be tripped into that business of us and them. And sometimes that's we need to think about that very carefully. And I think the Black community, I go back to the 60s, very conscious of the fact that there is no us and them. It is we. And we need to return to the we, because you can begin to softly, without realizing it, go back to that us and them. And that's why I think the way you've described, and I recognize that that's not the all, I know that, but the spirit allows us to think about it and get there.
Thank you both. We're getting very well. I think we're a little over time, but there are a few things. I mean, there are a lot of questions, but I think you've answered more than we could even think of. This is a great conversation. There's one question that I think has been addressed somewhat about pursuing this education through art and music, and maybe the intersection of those. But we have another question that came from Jimmy Patino on Facebook. How do we explain the inefficacy of the white liberalism that had dominated in Minnesota in the civil rights era? I don't know if either of you has a response to that, or if you want to.
I'm not sure I fully understand it. I'm not sure I fully. So Tish, if you've got some ideas, I might be able to gain them listening to you. I'm not sure I fully understood the question.
I'm going to repeat the question
but
for you.
I'll listen to.
I'm going to repeat the question for you, because I think that your expertise as a person who was an active participant in the civil rights era is appropriate. So his question was, how do we explain the inefficiency of the white liberalism that had momentum in Minnesota in the civil rights era?
Very good question. Because I think it couldn't survive because it wasn't understood. And I believe that what happened was that people began in that period to kind of just get along and try to be a collective, don't want to be different. I mean, to be a racist, a person that has some thought. So I think we skipped over the opportunity for conversation and discussion and explanation and true engagement. That's probably, it might be some of it, but thinking more about it, we almost have to think about what were we struggling and fighting for, and where did that go? What were we believing we could accomplish, and what did that do? It's because the treatment of us as a people is very complex, and it varies depending so much on the issue at the moment. And I'm not sure that that can be analyzed as easily as perhaps it should be.
Yeah. Tish, did you have anything to add, or?
I think that was perfect. I respect my elders' perspective on that one.
Great. Well,
It's hard, isn't it, Tish? It's to try to think about something that can actually be accomplished. It's
Yeah.
kind of hard.
well, yeah. And we do have an ongoing conversation about allies and what that means and what it doesn't mean. And I'm sure that will be continued on much after this. There's so many things that people have to think about from this conversation. I know we will hear more from both of you, and even from the work you've already done. I think both of you mentioned Tish's work tracks. I believe it is available on the TPT website.
Oh, I'll look
I want
for
to
it.
look into that. So folks should take a look at that. It's a great piece and it's a great performance. With that, I want to thank everyone for joining us and for hanging out in this wonderful space for so long. I hope that you will join us on March 4th. The Eastside Freedom Library continues, even in the time of pandemic, to have a lot of events happening. You can go to our website, eastsidefreedomlibrary.org, to see more of those events. The Ramsey County Historical Society has a lot of events going on. And we appreciate everybody who's been on this conversation. This conversation will be available again, archived on our Facebook page as well as our YouTube page. Feel free to take another look at it, share it with your friends, share it with your enemies maybe, or strangers. And with that, good night, and thank you again to our esteemed guests.
May I just say one thing,
Oh,
Clarence?
please do. Please do.
I want Tish to know, and I know I may have said it in different words throughout the night, but this has meant so much to me. Because I think what happens to us is we may focus on different aspects of what the end goal we think is, but to have an opportunity to hear from our younger people who are struggling as much as their ancestors did. The struggle doesn't seem to change. The struggle doesn't, but the strategies for resolving the struggle, and to hear that they are really thinking about that, how to go about it, what to do about our children, how to change the environment for them, is such a rewarding experience for their older elder ancestors. And I don't mean to embarrass Trish, and I know sometimes that can, but I just didn't want that moment. There have been so many times when I've wanted to say to her and her generation how important they are to us. And to have a moment when you're actually almost touching and have them, you want to be able to at least say it and hope that it's heard.
Received, elder, received humbly, gratefully, and I think I said this a couple times too, that I hope to just be a mirror to you. I'm so thankful to you as, a Black woman who has done this work in Minnesota. I know that I couldn't do half of what I do right now if it were not for you and for the work that you have done. And just as a young person, marching during the MLK marches and walking down the cold streets in the winter every year, you know what I mean? I've seen you do this work. I know you do this work, and you being that model gives me the strength and the courage to do the work. And, as we've talked about our work being inclusive and the changing of gender roles and so on and so forth, it is and always will be important to see a reflection. So to have been able to see a Black woman doing this work has been impactful for me. And to be in conversation with you tonight, the generosity that you have shown me this evening, that you've shown everybody with your words. I appreciate you. I receive. I'm not embarrassed. I actually welled up earlier. Okay. So
Good.
yeah, you got me emotional on
Well, thank you very much.
yeah, thank you.
Thank
So,
you, darling.
likewise.
And thank you, Clarence.
Again, thank you both. Your esteemed presence is more than welcome. So with that, I'm going to wish everyone a good evening, and we hope to see you again soon. And let's take this knowledge and apply it to our next steps in life. So have a great night.
Thank you.
Peace, everyone.